In 1968, Columbia University students occupied 5 campus buildings as part of a protest that resulted in a violent clash with police. Paul Cronin tells the story in his film, A Time to Stir. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Paul Cronin is a writer and filmmaker with a prolific output of films and books. If you don't know his name, that's partly because most of his work celebrates the careers of other people. He's responsible for the #1 film book I recommend to students, titled A Guide for the Perplexed, that collects Paul's interviews with Werner Herzog. Paul has edited books about Hollywood screenwriter Alexander McKendrick and Iranian filmmaker Abbas Kiarostami. He made documentaries about figures who played a crucial role in the cinema of the 1960s and 70s, Haskell Wexler, Amos Vogel, and Peter Whitehead. Paul's longest project is an oral history of the Columbia University student uprising in 1968. He's conducted over 700 interviews with students, faculty, police, journalists, and other eyewitnesses. The project is titled A Time to Stir, a phrase borrowed from Thomas Paine. I first met Paul when he was just embarking on A Time to Stir in 2006. He was hoping to complete it for the 40th anniversary of the uprising, but the project kept growing and he wasn't finished in 2008. That year, I invited him to present a 4-hour rough cut at the Toronto International Film Festival. Village Voice critic Scott Foundas wrote that it was the most vital film at the festival that year. Foundas described it as a major work about the American left, its splintering and factionalizing. So what happened at Columbia in 1968? It depends on who you ask. There are 2 key issues that sparked the protests. One was a plan for Columbia University to build a new gymnasium in Morningside Park that borders on Harlem. Protesters called it Jim Crow because the proposal had one gymnasium plan for the school and a separate facility for the local community. Opponents felt it smacked of segregation. The second protest issue was connected to America's war in Vietnam. Activists learned that Columbia had a relationship with a think tank on weapons research, the Institute for Defense Analysis. Protesters wanted Columbia to break those ties. These 2 issues have been building up until a mass demonstration in April led students to take control of 5 buildings. Here's a 1968 press conference where protest leaders give their demands.
We are here to protest the racist policies of this university. Columbia has consistently refused to alter these policies when the community has used the normal means of protest. We are therefore using this dramatic means of protest to highlight the following 4 demands. 1, the stopping of construction of the gym in Morningside Park. 2, the dropping of charges against all persons involved in demonstrations against the gym. 3, the breaking of all faculty and administrative ties with the Institute for Defense Analysis. 4, a general amnesty for the students involved in this demonstration. When the university has stopped construction of the gym and granted the amnesty, we will consider the question of negotiating with the university. We are prepared to remain here indefinitely until these conditions are met.
Paul spent years collecting testimonies and archive material that he eventually turned into a 10-part project with a running time of 15 hours. You can watch it all for free through his website, thestickingplace.com. See our show notes for a link. The material may be dense for a general audience, but for anyone who wants to understand what happened, it's an essential document. Even now, Paul may not be finished with it. He still toys with the possibility of cutting a shorter version to reach a new audience. Suddenly, this chapter of history has a fresh currency. This past month, when students protested Israel's war in Gaza, many saw echoes of 1968. The comparison was heightened when student protesters occupied Hamilton Hall and Columbia called in the New York Police Department to clear the building. I spoke to Paul a few days later. Our conversation begins with how he got started on A Time to Stir.
The whole idea of making a Columbia 68 film came directly out of another film that I had made about a British filmmaker called Peter Whitehead. He was a very interesting character. one might describe him as a kind of countercultural filmmaker in the second half of the 1960s in England and notably in New York. He made the first Rolling Stones film. He made a film in London in 1965 called Holy Communion, which is a document of the sort of first volley of the counterculture in England, Allen Ginsberg poetry reading, that kind of thing. And then he made a couple other things, but he ended up in America. He ended up in New York at the New York Film Festival. You and I think, in years past, Tom, have talked about Amos Vogel. And Amos invited Peter to the 1967 New York Film Festival. The short version is that Peter brought a camera and started making a film and was in New York on April 23rd, 1968, when the student protests at Columbia really exploded, if you will, and walked up to campus, if not that day, then the following day. I think it was the following day, actually, or even next but one. And he basically got inside the occupied buildings of Columbia in 1968 and filmed. Now, he used some of this footage in a film that he made in 1969 called The Fall. But the short version is I had access to all the outtakes, and they were quite remarkable. I also had some photos that he'd taken, not many. It was quite clear to me that this was a project that needed to be explored. Well, I first met Peter in 2001. My film about him screened at the Biennale in 2006, and I met a film producer there who basically said, I really like your Whitehead film, what do you want to do next? And I immediately said, we should do Columbia 68. Get it ready for the 40th anniversary in 2008. So this seemed feasible, you know. I thought, spend a year making a 90-minute documentary. To go back to your question, I don't need to go into too many details here, but I just grew up in a household in London, but my mother is American, and she came out of this kind of culture of, very broadly, culture of protest. I mean, very broadly in her case, because she's just older than the 68ers. And so I'd known about Columbia, and I'd known about Chicago 68, all these things that are coming back to bite us today, as it were.
Here's the thing I want to set up about Columbia 68 and thinking about when I first heard of your project is I knew about the students occupying buildings at Columbia, but when we think about all the events of 1968, it didn't factor as significant as I later came to feel it was after experiencing all of your scholarship around it. Because, just before the occupation of those buildings, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Later on that year are the so-called Days of Rage in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. So when we look back at 68, even I think of a film like The Weather Underground that features prominently Mark Rudd, who features prominently in your film, and Columbia 68 might get a mention, but so many things were happening so quickly that it, in a history of that period, it could easily be reduced to a couple sentences.
So there's a lot flying through my head as you're saying all that. I'm not sure if this will answer any question there might have been there. But so you mentioned The Weather Underground, for example. There was a documentary called Rebels with a Cause, which is about SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, the student protest movement, which is born more or less in the early 1960s. And then you've got Sam Green's Weather Underground documentary. A Time to Stir, which is the Columbia 68 film, is kind of a film between those two. It's sort of the part two, if that's a triptych, if you will. Because Columbia 68 shows how, very broadly, the student protest movement, as seen through SDS, becomes something other. And that other becomes the Weather Underground. And I remember very vividly, and maybe this was just, it makes sense to me. And I invoke the recently departed Paul Auster, who died, I think, a couple of days ago now, who's in my film. Paul was at Columbia in 1968. It was, I think, in 2008, for the 40th, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times where he described his generation as having gone crazy. So he used that word, and I thought to myself, the Weather Underground, to a certain extent, is about crazy people. And Rebels with a Cause is, to a certain extent, about, to use this, to invoke that same word, non-crazy people, if you will. Columbia 1968, and my film, I hope it does something which I think is interesting, which is somehow show how people became crazy. Now, the other piece of this is I seem to recall a Trivial Pursuit question. What word was purposely left out of the Godfather screenplay? Mafia. So I very purposely did not mention the Weather Underground in my documentary. No one mentions the Weather Underground. And believe me, people talked about it. But I cut around it. Because I think if people know what came after Columbia 68, have any knowledge of what came after Columbia 68, there is kind of not so much buried, but very aware all throughout A Time to Stir, a sense of what is about to happen to the world, to this country, to this movement, to these people, including, as you say, Mark Rudd, who became very involved with Weather Underground and is, I mean, let me put it this way, to talk to the sort of what the film involved, as well as filming 700 interviews on camera, I ended up collecting about 30,000 photographs from people, students, who were just in boxes in their attics. And I remember for the first time seeing a photo from, I think it was the fall of 1965, shortly after Mark Rudd arrived on campus. He's at a protest. He's wearing a suit and tie. He's wearing a sports jacket and tie. Mark Rudd wearing a sports jacket and tie in the fall of 1965. What happened? What happened? Columbia, A Time to Stir, I think, is a representation of that story of what happened.
So the one piece of historical significance that I always attributed to Columbia in 1968 before I saw your film is it stuck with me from reading histories that period, that people would talk about it as the point where there was a split between the old left and the new left. And for people for whom that might be an unfamiliar concept, I wonder if you could just explain what that meant.
Well, here's one way of looking at it. And I think it's, in terms of Columbia 68, maybe the most important, which is, let's just take as a sort of subset of the Columbia protesters, the black students. Now, many of the black students I interviewed for this film, and I think the group I interviewed for this film is fairly representative of the overall number of black students who were involved at Columbia 68. There were many who grew up in the South, in the segregated South. This is really the last generation who grew up, who were born under that shadow. And there are stories in the film about what life was like. In 1966, so these people would have, and they were at the March on Washington, for example, in 1963, and they heard Martin Luther King. By 1966, there is what we can describe as the rise of Black Power. Now, this is a blanket term for various different movements. And there are people in my film, Manning Marable, for example, Claiborne Carson, the late Manning Marable, who wrote a book on Malcolm X. I took a Malcolm X class with them at Columbia. These people explain this shift in ways much better than I could. But that's a good example in terms of black politics, of how old ideas, Martin Luther King's ideas, are kind of being flushed away. They're being displaced by a much more militant form of organization and politics, which we call Black Power.
Well, that leads well into my next question about setting up two broad groups that were that were part of campus life then. One is Students for Democratic Society, which I think histories up until the time of your film had really received the main focus of attention. But there was another group on campus called the Students Afro-American Society. And one of the real revelations of your film was the role that it was playing that had kind of been written out of history before 2008. Can you talk about what you learned as you were doing these interviews?
I was learning that the black students were an integral part, politically, strategically, to these protests. What was interesting, I mean, in retrospect, I look back and I was much surprised when I screened the film, and on campus in 2008, there was an event to mark the 40th anniversary, and many of the black students showed up and told stories that I'd been listening to for the last 18 months. So that I was quite familiar with them by that point. But it was an absolute revelation to the white students. They did not know of the lives the black students had been leading on campus. They did not know about what was really going on inside Hamilton Hall during those days, which became an exclusively black-held building for the last 6 days of the occupation. So that was it was an interesting historiographical moment for me, sort of realizing that I'd been documenting something. And I think it maybe, at that point, I realized maybe I'm actually doing real history here, because I've been interviewing pretty widely and I've done some archival research and found some things. And maybe this can be a new history of this event. But it was I didn't certainly set out to do that. I set out to make a 90-minute documentary. I think the point is, what is it now, 2024? The truth is, I've only really just finished the film. And I also edited in 2018 a big book of essays written by participants. So all in all, it's apparently it seems that it's a piece of history, which I think I'm quite happy with.
So you mentioned Hamilton Hall. That's a name that's been in the news lately, and so people may gravitate to it. Can you describe what the significance of Hamilton Hall was in 1968?
So the building is the first one to be occupied by students on the afternoon of April 23rd. But for various reasons, and not least, in very broad terms, the black power politics that were at play on the campus in 1968. What happens a few hours after that initial building occupation is that the black students asked the white students to leave the building. So at sort of 3, 4 in the morning, the white students leave Hamilton Hall and they essentially go over and take over another building and they expand the protest. But quite remarkably, for the final 6 days of the protest, Hamilton Hall is held exclusively by black people. I was going to say black students, but there were definitely some outsiders in there, people who were not students. By the way, this doesn't automatically mean that all the other 4 buildings were exclusively white. That's not the case at all. But we can say fairly definitively that Hamilton Hall was exclusively held by black students. And there are various reasons why this is important, not least strategically. It took 6 days for the administration to call the police in 1968. I think it's a fair thing to say that the likelihood of a police invasion of the campus, it would have come much earlier. That invasion would have come much earlier if one building had not been held by black students, which is to say that you can hardly ask the cops to come in and can you clear those 4 buildings but leave that one black building, as it were? Because there was a certain fear, as you point out, this is 3 weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King. There was a certain fear, and there had been riots in Harlem after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And as we know, Harlem is just down the road from Columbia. And there was a fear, I think, whether warranted or not, that Harlem would quote unquote rise up. Stokely Carmichael famously, and Rap Brown famously come to campus. Stokely Carmichael, who in 1966 takes over SNCC and sort of shifts SNCC into a much more black power direction. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organization. And Stokely shows up on campus in 1968 with H. Rap Brown, and Rap stands on the steps of Hamilton Hall and says basically, we're going to have to deal with this problem, because if we don't deal with it here, the people on the streets are going to deal with it. I'm only just slightly paraphrasing there. So that's why Hamilton is strategically such an important building. The black students historically never really got their due. The book that came out immediately after the student protest was written, and it's an excellent book, by the way. It's called Up Against the Ivory Wall. It was written by 21, 22-year-old kids who had been writing for and editing the student newspaper at Columbia, The Spectator. It's a remarkable achievement. There were other books, but rather tragically, I remember, I think at least one, possibly two of the black students telling me that they had shortly thereafter, 1968, sat down collectively and written a book. And they sent the one manuscript to a publisher who lost it. That's what I remember. I can get that clarified. So there would have been a book about the black participation in this protest, but alas, it was not to be. So anyway, so Hamilton...
So the fact that history was obscured afterwards, is it... can we attribute to that history's largely written by white historians and they were just missing this the significance of what Hamilton Hall meant?
Very possibly. That's certainly a viable reason. As it were, logistically, the press were not allowed into Hamilton Hall. I could speak decades later. I think it speaks to this question. For example, I was very lucky to even find any photos taken inside Hamilton Hall. There were not many. They were very careful about the press representation. They knew very well that they were already being misrepresented in the press. There's an extraordinary clip that ends chapter 3 of the film, which is April 23rd, 1968. The last moments of that chapter is an on-screen news anchor standing outside Hamilton Hall on April 24th, 1968, describing the building as being held by, quote, militant Negroes, unquote. Now, if you knew who was actually inside Hamilton Hall, you would never meaningfully describe them as militant Negroes. Many of them were very proper, well-behaved, extremely well-behaved, if you will, and very righteous black students who kept that place spick and span. They were very respectful of that space, very respectful of it. So that is very much one reason why there's just not that much archival material about Hamilton Hall. So one had to really go to these people and one had to persuade them.
Some of the other buildings were interacting with press more, and so their story was getting told more.
I found, for example, one guy alone had 3,000 photographs that he took inside Fairweather Hall. That alone says something. Plus, the blacks were not constantly on the mimeograph machines. They were very careful about the messaging. The case of Hamilton Hall makes us realize that, we can't really ever talk about the students. It's very unfair to talk about the students, Every student had his or her own motivation for being there, aside from the fact that there were 5 buildings and they weren't indiscriminately kind of organized. They almost had a philosophy of action, each building. Hamilton Hall was exclusively black. Fairweather, which I mentioned, was the largest of the communes, if you will, and largely held by older, more mature graduate students. It was where the history department was, sociology department, anthropology department, mathematics. held by the quote unquote the crazies. A lot of, to use this word, this phrase, if you will, the outside agitators. Um, Tom Hayden was in mathematics, for example, leading debates. There was a anarchist, East Village anarchist group called the Motherfuckers, who were inside mathematics. Avery, the architecture students, pretty much exclusively in Avery, who were perfectly used to working throughout the night anyway. So when they were told that they had to leave campus, were sort of thinking, no, we have work to do. So they almost occupied their building by accident. They didn't sort of mean to occupy the building. And then we have Low Library, which is the only one of the 5 buildings that isn't in the occupation only has one tiny corner of the building, the suite of presidential offices. So Hamilton, Low Library is going on around them, and Low Library, which is the big building behind the Alma Mater statue. If you're facing Alma Mater, it's the building behind her. It's the chief administration offices of the university. Low Library is a small commune, and it's difficult to characterize them, but I think broadly speaking, they're what we might call leadership. We can get onto the very notion of leadership at Columbia 68, but the leaders were very militant left-wing ideologues. Let's call them that. One doesn't want to paint too broad a brush, because again, every student is there for a different reason. So anyway, so historiographically, we have to be very careful when we use terms like students and leadership at Columbia 68.
So when it comes time for negotiations to take place between students and the administration, what happens there?
Well, so this is a bigger question about where the movement goes and in what direction the movement is traveling. At least that seems to be one way of answering your question, because there were numerous demands being issued by the protesting students, the leadership cadre, if you will. And one of them was amnesty. Right, so the idea that
which kind of
no matter
becomes,
what happens,
in my memory of your film, amnesty for the students who have been protesting gradually becomes the main point of contention and kind of overrides whatever the other points were around the gym or pulling back involvement in Vietnam.
This is exactly right, Tom. This is exactly right. At a certain point, the gym, the construction of the gymnasium, which we haven't talked about, but very quickly the university was planning to build essentially a university gym, a private gymnasium in public space in Morningside Park, which is a stone's throw from the campus. We could do a whole hour on that alone, but that kind of gets displaced, as you say, that demand gets displaced, as does, to use a word that, interestingly enough, I'm fairly certain I never heard once when I was working on my Columbia film, although now, today, the events are framed in this way: divestment from the military-industrial complex. One never, I'm happy to stand corrected on this, but that word really wasn't used in 1968, divestment. As you say, those demands sort of got displaced by the one demand that the student leadership, insofar as the student leadership existed, sorry for making all these qualifications, but the demand of amnesty displaces all others because it's the one demand that they know the Columbia administration will never accede to. And what does that do and what does that mean? And by the way, this is not some formulation I've come up with. There are plenty of people in my film talking about this, fully admitting, if you will, not sure if that's the right word, if that's not maybe the word they would use, but explaining that this is the tactic. The tactic is we've got to keep these kids in the buildings long enough so they get beaten up by the cops. And that is then filmed, and the world will see it. And if you recall a few months later at Chicago, what is the big chant? The whole world is watching. And that's what happens at Columbia on the night of April 30th, 1968, which, however you cut it, the police acted badly, to say the least.
Well, I want to come to that
They
in
okay.
a minute. Um, but can you kind of elaborate on uh, this as a that you're describing as a motive, and and how that comes across in the research that you've done and the testimonies you collected?
It was so. I should just. This was a revelation. I mean, insofar as I tell that piece of the story, it certainly wasn't there. I didn't think I was going to tell that story. I mean, I just started interviewing people, and I interviewed a couple hundred people before I started editing, and that was just very clearly one piece of the story that emerged. Uh, I mean, to sort of talk about the film for a second, the film is divided into 10 chapters. And the last several years of interviews, I mean, once I found that structure of the 10 chapters, which is very broadly 10 things, 10 bits, it was quite clear, it became clear that while people would say things beyond those 10 chapters, nothing was as compelling as those 10 things that I found. And number 9, if you will, that chapter called Leadership, is about this tactic. And it's about the shift that takes place on the left. And it is what Sam Green documents in The Weather Underground. But we see the seeds of it at Columbia. We see the seeds of it. We see, and again, these are not my words. These are words spoken by people in the film. An anti-democratic strain. There's a moral righteousness that is felt by these people. And one can only act in a certain way when one is caught in that psychology. There is no other way to act. And one piece of 1968, which I think is an important one, is that, broadly speaking, institutions like Columbia run on a code of conduct that can be overturned at any minute by any constituency if they really so choose to do so. It's the soft underbelly, the universities. And the faculty at Columbia in 1968 played a very interesting role. And just by dint of logistics and where I was at the time, I spent a lot of time with a guy called Alan Silver, who's in my film, who was a very dignified, honorable guy, solidly of the left, who found what was going on at Columbia in 1968 deeply troubling. And he was as anti-war as anyone, was Alan. But he found what the students were doing, occupying buildings, disrupting education. He found it to be deeply troubling, while he very broadly, or not so broadly, fully supported their aims. And he loved these students. He talks in the film about, actually, I'm not sure if it's in the film, but one of his favorite students was Ted Gold. Ted Gold was by all accounts, quite brilliant undergraduate student who was one of the 4 people, I think it is, who dies in the townhouse bombing in early 1970, which is the moment that sort of, as it were, precipitates the Weather Underground. Ted was one of those people who died that day.
Can you talk about the role of student reporters? You mentioned them briefly before, but how was the student press covering the event?
By all accounts, excellently. As I say, the book that they wrote, Up Against the RV Wall, is excellent. One can go onto the Columbia Spectator website today and read the reports. They are very good. But we must also remember the radio station, of course, WKCR. The archives of 1968 are more or less extant. Then they've been transferred, and they make for fascinating reading. And there are various moments. I figured I could get away with this only once every 2 hours or so. And the film is 15 hours. My film is 15 hours. So I'm sort of making this up. No more than 10 times I just cut to a blank screen and we just hear some judiciously edited KCR material. The thing to point out, and it's very, very, very important notion, which is that at moments like this, the campus is in various ways locked down, and the only people on the campus are the students. And so they're there, and sometimes they're the only people there. And more than that, they probably know or are familiar with or have friends who are very involved in these events. So they know and they know the campus. They've been on campus for at least a year. They know the politics. The point is they know a lot more than any outside journalists that come in. And in 1968, Robert Friedman, who was the editor of the Columbia Spectator, talked about in 1968 the mainstream press, as it were, coming in and essentially asking him, Friedman, and the other reporters, really what's going on here? Get us up to speed on this thing, kind of thing. So the student press played a very important part. The radio recordings are really quite remarkable. And interestingly, one figure who came out of that moment is Bob Siegel, who, of course, had a long NPR career, who cut his teeth as a chief anchor, which is a very tough job, technologically, I would think, and also just staying up for all that time. And so student press plays an important part. I think they won an award. There's a New York Times article I can dig out about an award being given to WKCR for its coverage. By the way, KCR covers the whole of New York City. There's a very interesting moment in 1968, and Fred Pack, who was at the center of this moment, wrote an essay about this for my 68 book. But essentially, at one point, the administration asked KCR to go off the air. They felt that by broadcasting details of these events, they were somehow drawing outsiders to campus. And they asked KCR to go off the air. Bob talks about this in the film. In the end, Fred talks about this in the film. Fred talks about how within minutes of them going off the air, they were getting calls from mainstream media, Time Magazine, the New York Times. Like, essentially, KCR was the major source of news for many people around the country at that moment in time.
And so were they restored back to the air?
They were restored back. Essentially, I think the faculty administration realized this is a pretty dumb idea. And presumably, as KCR were getting phone calls from, the New York Times, so was Grayson Kirk's office, Grayson Kirk, the president of the university. I mean, one can assume that, given the fact that, for example, Bill Paley, head of CBS, was on the board of trustees of Columbia. I mean, there's certainly high-level connections between the Columbia administration and the media structures of New York City, to say the least.
So what did you learn about how the administration handled this?
The administration, oh boy, Tom. Grayson Kirk, he was an anachronism. He was a walking anachronism. He was a sort of stereotype of a stuffy, out-of-touch university president. I just noticed that maybe it had been up forever, but I have a feeling they put it up just in the last few days. Grayson Kirk went on Face the Nation in early May 1968, and he gave an on-camera interview about all this. This is, as I recall, a few days after the police bust. So you can go on and watch this guy. Look, the administration was caught between a rock and a hard place. It's very difficult, as I say, to work through these problems. They don't have any kind of security that's going to prevent this sort of thing from happening at Columbia in 1968. They're really at the mercy of people's good nature to a certain extent. And things are just bubbled over. There's definitely a piece of this narrative that certainly throughout the year 1967 through to 68, and certainly actually before that, the administration was very noticeably out of touch with the student body. So that's certainly a piece of the narrative.
In the 10th and final chapter of A Time to Stir, Paul interviews several police officers who took part in the raid. Like every other group in this story, they have varying points of view. Several people describe that the police were largely alienated from the campus culture. That's reflected in this interview with Officer John Ryan.
I went in the Navy, I was 18. I went in the job, I was 22. So what am I now, 23, 24? And I got some punky kid, 22 years old, screaming at me, "Hey, pig, go home." I'll give you, pig. These are guys that never raised their hand in their life, never had a fist fight in their life. I was raised in the streets of the Bronx. I've been duking and fighting ever since I'm a kid. And you're going to call me a pig and then expect to get away with it? I'm kicking your ass. And you're going to deserve it. You don't have the right to call me a pig. I got a wife and a couple of kids I'm going home to. What are you doing? You're going back, smoke dope, and try and bang that broad with the long hair. That's all it was, I'm telling you.
I talk about all these different constituencies on campus, all these different people out for different motivations. But it seems to me if there's one thing that binds everyone together, if there's one thing that everyone can agree on, obviously not everyone, but I think, a majority, is we really shouldn't have to call the cops on this thing if we can help it. It's not a good idea. It's not going to be good. From the guys in the mayor's office through to the faculty, to the students, even members of the administration who kind of, as I say, kind of equivocated for all those days. I talked to a guy called Tom Callahan, who was one of the more senior members of the administration, who was still alive when I talked to him. And he said they definitely talked about bringing the cops in the first night. But sort of once you lose that momentum, and as it were, and then the weekend came. So sort of the bust happens on a Monday night. So everyone agreed that, if we can avoid calling the cops, let's call the cops. Because once you call the cops, you have no control over the cops. You have no control over what they're going to do. They decide how they're going to handle this. So what happened on that campus that night really was awful. They cleared the buildings very violently. I think too violently, frankly.
But again, maybe historical context is important here. This is the year after massive uprisings in urban centers in Newark and Detroit, and there was a mentality, rightly or wrongly, between police and people fighting against the police, that this was a war.
Tom, I'm willing to give the cops a lot of leeway here, but having spoken to people I spoke to and read what I read and seen the photos, they cleared the buildings very violently. They handled Hamilton Hall with kid gloves. Those students were transported out of Hamilton Hall, not a scratch. Hamilton Hall was dealt with very differently from the other four buildings. But the point is that once the buildings were cleared, the police then went and attacked everyone who was on campus. When they were told to clear the campus, I don't know if they misunderstood, but they didn't just clear the 5 buildings. They smashed their way through that campus and out onto the streets on Broadway. This is all documented in the film. It's quite horrendous. One piece of this is very interesting, which is that, again, we can't just talk about the police. We have to distinguish, say between the mounted police, the local, as we would call them back home, Bobby on the beat, the local precinct cops, and the TPF, the Tactical Patrol Force, which was basically parachuted into hotspots across the city. They had no real connection to that neighborhood. They didn't really know any of the big issues. They had also, the police, broadly speaking, I'm going to say TPF, I would think, they were there for days, sort of sitting in vans, getting very bored with the whole thing. Again, they articulates in the film. They really did not want to be there. So, if you will, when they were unleashed, they gave the students hell. The TPF more so than anyone. There are some great stories in the film about students being kind of grabbed by a bunch of cops. And I think this happens twice in the film. 2 students independently said, we were grabbed by a bunch of cops, and the precinct cop stepped forward and said, he's mine, I'll take him, and sort of grabbed the student away from the TPF. shoved him around the corner and said, "Get the hell out of here. Just get out of here, because they're going to beat the shit out of you. You know, I'm a precinct cop. I know this beat. I'm not going to mess with you people unnecessarily. Just get out of here." So that happened. So again, we can't just talk about the cops. We have to distinguish between, frankly, each individual police officer. Men and women. I actually talked to a female cop who was, fascinating to listen to her stories.
Can you share something there that stands out?
Just the dignity and the empathy that she had with these students, particularly the female students, just making sure that they were okay, really. Also, laughing as one might. There are stories of the wagons just being too full. I mean, they arrested hundreds of people that night. The wagons were too full, and there were students that absolutely insisted on being arrested. She talks about, okay, all right, Doc, just calm down. We'll get you in the van. Don't worry. It's very funny. It was a point of pride to be arrested at Columbia in '68.
Today, there's a lot of looking back on Columbia '68 and what it meant. I was struck just in the last couple of days. Nicholas Kristof wrote a piece in the New York Times where he wrote, those students didn't shorten the Vietnam War. Instead, they probably prolonged it, he writes, attributing the violent protests that were happening in that era as helping to elect Nixon on a law and order ticket. I wonder, in the people that you interviewed, looking back, the different interpretations of what it meant.
I certainly spoke to people for whom Columbia '68 remains the central pivot point in their life, for good or ill. I mean, one piece of this, which I like, there's this sort of little sequence of this in the film, just the transformations that go on when one is involved in a communal event of that kind, the personal, as opposed to the political transformations that go on. But of course, the personal is the political. My friend, the late Todd Gitlin, I think he described the end result in 1968, we won the culture, they won the politics. As someone says in the film, I mean, there's a whole piece of this, the whole piece of this is in the film about what does it mean to do politics? What is the use of this protest? Is it purely symbolic? If it is purely symbolic, does symbolic protest have a value? Does it have value? While the right is massing, you're busy invading the English department. I mean, what are you doing? Is one piece of this, is one question that is, I think, legitimately asked. What is the value of this protest? It got the gym stopped in Morningside Park, although people aren't going to want to hear this, but I talked to plenty of people who expressed back in the day, and certainly today, that maybe it would have been a good thing for a gym to have been built in Morningside Park. I can tell you that only as a historian. That is what I heard from people. And there's footage in the film of, for what it's worth, a black employee of Columbia. He looks like some kind of sports coach of some kind, because they did sports down in Morningside Park. And he's standing in Morningside Park and he's explaining that this craggy cliff isn't much good for anything. So let's dynamite it and build a gymnasium. So that's one piece of this narrative. And let's not forget the exact date, 1960, 1961. The city and I think the state signed off on Columbia's use of this land in Morningside Park. For various reasons, construction is delayed, and the political climate is very, very different in 1967, 68. You're not going to get that kind of thing built in Harlem in 1967, 68, whereas you may have been earlier in the decade. Were the objectives of the students achieved? If one sort of scrolls down the list of demands, I mean, broadly speaking, yes. But again, the bigger question is, Well, so what? So you stop the gym in the park. Columbia is no longer doing, maybe to the extent that it was, war research on campus. So what? Noam Chomsky is in the film. Chomsky talks about at MIT in the 1960s, the demand of trying to kick the military researchers off campus was a ludicrous demand. First of all, they're just going to do it somewhere else. And secondly, maybe we can somehow learn more about what they're doing if they're close to home. He talks about this in the film. I'm sure he would talk about it today, given the chance. It's not a meaningful goal, he describes it as. I think those are his words in the film. Look, it should be said that I don't think that I take a political point of view with my film. I think it's a fairly even-handed representation of events. I interviewed everyone I could find, from the Maoist revolutionaries through to the cops who beat them up, and everyone in between. I interviewed a whole load of students who were anti-student, anti the protests. I wrote an article for Politico about Bill Barr on campus. Bill Barr was on campus in 1968 as an undergraduate, part of a group called the Majority Coalition, which was a group of, let's just call them conservative students who were not terribly happy about what was going on their campus. That does not mean in any way that they were pro-war or pro-gym. It just meant that they were slightly aggrieved at the fact that they couldn't get to class.
You've devoted a big chunk of your life to studying Columbia 1968. As there's a new uprising happening in 2024, do you feel a temptation to be plunging into that?
Somewhat. I did not go to campus. I have not been to campus for various reasons. And I realized post hoc that may serve me well. Because there is very clearly, as expressed by protesting students and the world's media, the notion of the legacy of 1968, which is today's protests. And they fascinate me on those terms. Absolutely fascinate me as to what's going on. In my mind, I'm constantly trying to compare the two. The problem is that I don't know enough about 1968, and I certainly don't know enough about 2024. So if I genuinely feel I don't know enough about 1968, God only knows what these journalists who are writing these comparison pieces really are dealing with. A lot of what I've been reading seems very simplistic, unfortunately so. And it's difficult to make comparisons, meaningful comparisons. And by meaningful, I mean substantive comparisons at a historical level as to why these two events are worth comparing. Some people would say that they're very, very different. Very different. The general piece of this in the media today, and certainly commentators from 1968 that I've read and listened to, is that they're entirely comparable. That is a political position that they've taken there. It must be said. There's nothing wrong with that. But the point is, some people may disagree that there are legitimate comparisons to be made between 1968 and 2024.
What would your advice be to people who are going to try to tell the story of 2024?
More is more. I shot this whole thing on my own. I would sometimes I'd fly out to the Bay Area for 5 days. I had 6 interviews scheduled per day for 5 days. I would just drive from one interview to the other. You never know what people are going to say. You never know what stories they're going to tell you. More is more. I mean, I ended up with more than 700, give or take, filmed interviews for this project. Some of which for 15 minutes, some of which for 4 hours. Get it all. The other thing is that, as that Colombia is a middle-class rebellion. If you look at a crowd shot, every fourth person has a camera around their neck. So I found a lot of great images, but that's obviously nothing to what imagery has already been accumulated. I suppose, and this really is an important point. If it's not clear already, I'll just make it clear, at least in my mind, that the most useful thing that you can do if you want to tell the story of 2024 in film is to tell all sides. Tell the story from all sides. Otherwise, it will really egregiously lose meaning, which is to say that if you do make an effort to represent all points of view, one can presume, one can hope, will be a document that will be around forever. Otherwise, it's just a piece of propaganda.
I want to thank Paul Cronin for speaking with me. You can watch all 10 parts of A Time to Stir, along with Paul's other films, for free on his website, thestickingplace.com. See our show notes for details. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, newsletter manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.